Chapter 776, Xue Wuye's Invitation. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. The old woman clad in red nodded. She stood up, though her back was still bent, and rasped out, "You are very talented. I hope that you will become accomplished in the future. Now, you have fused 3 sword intents. As long as you continue working hard, you'll definitely make great achievements." Zhang Yuochen's expression changed a bit. "Granny, do you know the source of my 3 sword intents?" "I know a bit, but it's not very significant. In the future, if you help the Yin and Yang sect past challenges, you'll repay the 3. With that, the old woman walked away from the place. Zhang Yuochen stood up. He bowed to her, eyes filled with respect. For 9 days and nights, Zhang Yuochen had absorbed so much knowledge about the saintly way. Thus, he closed his eyes and settled down to start organizing his thoughts. This lasted for half a month. Finally, Zhang Yuochen's mind became clear again. He didn't worry about how long he'd been cultivating in the sword pavilion. Everything felt so natural. Fusing the sword intents of the 3 Grand Masters indeed brings endless benefits. I've cultivated 3,000 sword techniques, completed Sword 2's cultivation and even cultivated Sword 3 to the 2nd level. I wonder how much power I can release if I can complete Sword 3 while in the Fish Dragon realm. This thought flashed past Zhang Yuochen's mind for a second before he gave up on it. Sword 3 had 6 levels, while he'd only reached the 2nd level. It was possible to complete Sword 3 with his current human sword state. However, it would take a lot of time and cost more than what he'd receive. The Sword Emperor from 800 years ago had been so magnificent. He could have completed Sword 3 in the Fish Dragon realm. It wasn't very meaningful though and would waste a lot of time. After all, it would be comparably easy to cultivate Sword 3 after reaching the Half-Saint realm. Right now, my most important task is to determine a rule for the Tao of the Sword. If possible, I must try my hardest and determine a rule for space and time as well. Zhang Yuochen was very clear about what he wanted. Thus, he wouldn't become lost. In the time following that, he began putting his all into creating a rule of the Tao of the Sword. With his current cultivation state and his knowledge of the Tao of the Sword, Zhang Yuochen was confident that it wouldn't take long before he could create a rule. Around half a month later, the Moonbriar Sword Scent returned to the 7th level of the Sword Pavilion. His vision was amazing and he noticed Zhang Yuochen's huge change instantly. He was very surprised. "Lin Yue," he said, "your Tao of the Sword has improved again." Reading the wordless sword manual is indeed beneficial, Zhang Yuochen said. "My Tao of the Sword has already reached the pinnacle of the heart integrated into sword." The human sword state was too shocking. Zhang Yuochen didn't dare to reveal it so casually. "Amazing, truly amazing," the Moonbriar Sword Saint exclaimed. "You're so young, but you've already reached a level that even some saints can't reach. You really are a genius in the Tao of Sword. Perhaps only the Sword Emperor from the past can be compared to you." At first, he hadn't had much hope for Zhang Yuochen. The Moonbriar Sword Saint thought that reading the wordless sword manual was a complete waste of time. However, when he learned that Zhang Yuochen had reached the pinnacle of the heart integrated into sword, all his previous incomprehension and doubt vanished. All that remained was fascination and praise. How could he judge a sword genius the way he looked at a common man? Zhang Yuochen and the Moonbriar Sword Saint walked out of the Sword Pavilion. On the white stone square outside the Sword Pavilion, many disciples were transporting spiritual crystals and beasts to the top of the altar. The stronger the beast, the higher it goes. Remember to check every crystal so the matrix will be activated successfully on the day of the Sword Technique Conference. The Sword Technique Conference was a once-in-a-century event. The first step was the sacrifice ceremony. Beasts would be killed, their blood sacrificed to the gods. It was a very somber and sacred event. There could be no mishaps. Today is September 7th. The Moonbriar Sword Saint said. The Sword Technique Conference is 2 days from now, on the 9th. Come to the Sword Pavilion again tomorrow night. There's something very important that I must tell you beforehand. Zhang Yuochen bowed to the Moonbriar Sword Saint. Then he left the Sword Pavilion and walked down Ancient Gods Mountain. Returning to Shintai City, he walked down the street. All the conversations he heard were about the 9 heirs. People discussed them, describing their legendary stories. Of course, many were also discussing who was the strongest. Monk Lidai has the Buddhist butcher sword. He killed Jialuogu in the 1,000 treasure cassock with 2 strikes. He's definitely powerful enough to be ranked first. I don't think so. Monk Lidai could kill Jialuogu, mostly because he'd borrowed the power of the Buddhist butcher sword. If we talk about true abilities, Xue Wuye is definitely undefeatable. After all, he's the top sword genius in the past 500 years. Apparently, he completed Sword 2. If Xue Wuye could learn the Sword Emperor's saintly flying fairy sword, he might really be able to defeat Monk Lidai. See, by that logic, if Ouyang Huan could learn the demonic sect's saint weapon life-death furnace, wouldn't he have no competition in his realm? In my opinion, you shouldn't consider their weapons when ranking the 9 heirs. Otherwise, Lin Yue, who's only powerful with the Void Sword, would be comparable to the 9 heirs, wouldn't he? Saint weapons are part of one's power. You're just jealous. You dare to say that senior brother apprentice Lin Yue is only powerful because of his Void Sword? I'll fight you to the death. Zhang Yuochen seemed calm. He passed through the crowded streets with a unique step. Hearing all the different comments, he just smiled. All these people were discussing the 9 heirs and 108 young kings. It was clear how influential the heir banquet was. It had already ended and some people had left. However, some people stayed. After all, the Sword Technique Conference was another lively event. Arriving at Sword Saint Xuanji's residence, Zhang Yuochen finally stopped. He saw a very elegant carriage outside in the near distance. The beast pulling the carriage was a blood gold raven, more than 10 meters tall. It radiated with hot flames. If not for the matrix around it, the stone ground would have probably melted under it. The blood gold raven was a 6th class lower beast. Its combat abilities were comparable to a grade 1 half saint. Nowadays, only one person in Shentai City could control a blood gold raven. It was Xue Wuye, descendant of the Sword Emperor. 2 girls dressed in white stood by the carriage, one on either side. They were pretty and had both reached the 7th change of the fish dragon realm. Zhang Yuochen obviously knew that Xue Wuye was pursuing Huang Yanjun. Thus, he didn't find it strange that Xue Wuye's carriage would be here. With his hands behind his back, Zhang Yuochen walked towards the blood gold raven's carriage. He didn't stop until he was 30 feet from the carriage. The flow of holy chi in the 2 sword servants sped up. They'd instantly entered the defensive state. In the past, these 2 would have attacked without hesitation. But after the air banquet, they recognized this man called Lin Yue. They knew he was very powerful and able to compete with the heirs. They couldn't fight him. Is Xue Wuye of the Fragrance City in the carriage? Zhang Yuochen asked. The carriage was the size of a small pavilion. It was constructed with luxurious materials and a faint fragrance wafted out. The servant on the left said, "It is indeed our young city governor." Zhang Yuochen nodded. In that case, please tell Xue Wuye that he'd better stay away from Princess Yanjun. Otherwise, I won't mind seeing if my sword is faster than his. After the battle at the air banquet, everyone in the world knew that Lin Yue was pursuing Huang Yanjun. Thus, he wasn't afraid of speaking more directly. Rich baritone laughter sounded in the carriage. What if I said that I'm waiting for you instead of Princess Yanjun? Xue Wuye would wait for a man? Zhang Yuochen asked in return. To be honest, I'm not interested in men. I don't have much patience either, Xue Wuye said. You're the first man I've ever waited for. So, what do you think? I'm so earnest. Won't you come up for a drink? Sure. Zhang Yuochen wasn't scared. He walked to the gold blood raven's carriage and climbed the steps one by one. Whoosh! A beautiful girl reached out her snowy white hand and lifted the curtains, welcoming Zhang Yuochen in. Xue Wuye sat on white fox hide. There was a small exquisite jade table beside him. 2 glass cups sat on the table, one before another. Even from the distance, Zhang Yuochen could still smell the fragrant wine in the cups. There were 4 young girls on either side of Xue Wuye. They were all complete beauties that could win over a city's heart. The carriage's inside was also glamorous. Each small decoration was worth a city. No wonder this man was the Fragrance City's young city governor. He knew how to enjoy himself. Xue Wuye looked up, staring at Zhang Yuochen. The corner of his lips turned up. While drinking wine, he smiled and said, You must be struggling over whether your fiancé or your demonic sect lover is more important, right? Zhang Yuochen's eyes narrowed at Xue Wuye. Fiancé? He asked. If Princess Yanqian isn't your fiancé, might she be mine? Xue Wuye had an ambiguous expression. The time and space descendant is dead. But Lin Yue is still alive, isn't he? You think that you've seen through me? Zhang Yuochen sat across from Xue Wuye. He lifted a glass cup and took a sip. Xue Wuye chuckled. Lifting a cup, he said, Brother Yuochen, no offense, but you're too emotive, just like me. You're more suitable for being a player in the game of life.